Welcome to The Last Climb. Today we're going to uncover the Everest climb where two elite endurance athletes whose ratings repeatedly questioned many of the safety practices other climbers considered essential. Years of trusting their own judgment and endurance, experience influenced decisions that set them apart from almost everyone else on the mountain. Looking back, the routines they skipped were helping everyone else get down. It was May 18th, 2017. Around 22 climbers from 4 different expedition teams left Camp 4 on Everest's South Col and began their summit push along the southeast ridge. The forecast showed a short period of stable weather that was expected to last until later that morning, so the teams planned to reach the summit and start heading back down before conditions changed. One of those climbers was Marek Czerwinski. He was 53 years old and from Bielsko-Biała, Poland. He worked as a structural engineer for most of his career, but outside of work he spent many years competing in endurance events. He completed several editions of the Badwater 135 and the Marathon des Sables before eventually moving into mountaineering. Badwater and Marathon des Sables back to back. That resume genuinely stopped me for a second. Those aren't things most people finish once. As he gained experience, he completed glacier travel, crevasse rescue, and alpine climbing courses. He also climbed both Mont Blanc and Aconcagua before joining the Everest expedition. Although this was his first climb above 8,000 meters, he wrote and spoke confidently about the preparation and training that had brought him there. His wife, Agnieszka Czerwińska, was 50 years old and came from Wrocław. She reached high-altitude climbing through a different background. When she was younger, she competed in swimming at the national junior level, and later she began doing triathlons, eventually completing full Ironman distance races while working as a physical education instructor in Kraków. She and Marek had trained together for nearly 18 years after meeting through a local trail running club. Friends described Agnieszka as the more methodical of the two. She usually followed her training plans closely and paid careful attention to pacing during long events. Like Marek, she had spent many years in endurance sports, and both often spoke about preparation and determination as the foundation of their success in endurance sports. And they approached Everest with that same mindset. The Everest attempt wasn't some last-minute decision. Marek and Agnieszka had actually been working toward it for about 5 years, and along the way they documented their training on a Polish-language sports blog that had a small but loyal following of endurance athletes. The way they saw Everest was a little different from a lot of other climbers. They didn't really think of it as a traditional mountaineering goal. They frequently described Everest as an endurance challenge, comparing it to the races they had already completed. I get why they framed it that way. With that background, Everest probably looks like the only logical ceiling left to hit. As the expedition got closer, they started speaking more openly about the way Everest was being climbed. In blog posts and conversations about the mountain, they questioned a lot of the things that had become standard on commercial expeditions, fixed schedules, constant guide oversight, supplemental oxygen, and long lists of safety procedures. In one blog post, Marek wrote that Everest had become a mountain of checklists instead of courage. It was a theme that surfaced repeatedly in his writing. He often argued that climbers had become too dependent on systems and procedures, and not dependent enough on their own judgment and preparation. Marek's writing often argued that exceptionally fit athletes should have more freedom to make their own decisions instead of strictly following procedures designed for commercial clients. Agnieszka expressed many of the same views. Together, their comments suggested that they saw some of those measures as more important for less experienced or less physically conditioned climbers. That philosophy shaped their expedition. They booked with a Nepalese commercial operator for permits and logistical support, but declined a fully guided package, choosing instead to manage their own summit schedule and pace. During the mandatory medical briefing, both attended sessions on altitude illness, hydration, and the effects of climbing in the death zone. Marek later wrote that while dehydration at extreme altitude was real, he believed the recommended fluid intake was more conservative than athletes with exceptional cardiovascular fitness required. I keep thinking about what that briefing room looked like for him, sitting there, trained and fit, watching slides he was convinced were made for someone he didn't resemble at all. Before leaving Camp 4, while the other climbers were making their final equipment checks beneath the glow of headlamps, Marek took out a small handheld camera and recorded a short video for the couple's sports blog. Standing beside Agnieszka, with the dark outline of Everest rising behind them, he reinforced the philosophy they had written about for years. Rather than treating Everest as a mountain that somehow judged or humbled those who climbed it, he described it as nothing more than rock, ice, and weather, a place governed by preparation and physical ability rather than myth or superstition. Near the end of the recording, Merrick remarked that the mountain would have to work a lot harder than people claimed if it wanted to stop them. The couple laughed, packed away the camera, clipped into the fixed ropes, and joined the line of climbers leaving Camp 4. The footage was later recovered from Merrick's camera and became one of the clearest surviving records of the mindset with which the couple began their summit push. The route they were following, the southeast ridge on Everest's Nepal side, begins at Camp 4 on the South Col, roughly 26,000 feet above sea level, before passing the balcony, the south summit, the Hillary Step, and finally the summit at 29,032 feet. The total elevation gain is about 3,000 feet. While that would be manageable on a lower mountain, above 26,000 feet, it becomes one of the most physically demanding climbs on Earth because the body can no longer properly adapt to the extreme altitude. In the death zone, the available oxygen is only about 1/3 of that at sea level, causing physical performance and mental clarity to steadily decline. At the same time, rapid breathing and the extremely cold, dry air cause climbers to lose large amounts of fluid through respiration, while the normal sensation of thirst becomes significantly weaker. As a result, dehydration often develops without obvious warning, making regular hydration a critical part of safe climbing. Years of endurance competition had trained them to continue performing despite fatigue and discomfort, conditions that can resemble some of the early effects of dehydration and altitude stress. The endurance world had handed them proof over and over that discomfort was just noise. It makes complete sense to me that they trusted it here. As dehydration gets worse, the body starts losing plasma, so the blood gradually becomes more concentrated. That means the heart has to work harder, and it also becomes more difficult to get enough oxygen to the muscles and the brain. On Everest, that was only part of the problem. The extreme altitude, the cold, hours of climbing, and not eating enough all added more stress to the body at the same time. The cold also causes blood vessels in the arms and legs to narrow, which reduces blood flow. Meanwhile, the lack of oxygen at that altitude slowly affects coordination, judgment, and muscle endurance. So as the climb goes on, fatigue starts building faster. Muscle cramps become more likely, and even simple movements begin taking a lot more effort than they normally would. At first, though, the changes can be easy to miss. Your legs start feeling a little heavier, your thinking slows down, and you feel unusually exhausted, even after stopping to rest for a few minutes. My first read of those early symptoms is always the same. That sounds exactly like mile 70 of an ultra marathon. For climbers like Marek and Agnieszka, who had spent decades training themselves to push through fatigue, those early warning signs could easily seem like just another hard day of endurance rather than a sign that several physical stresses were all starting to catch up with them. Both of them were using supplemental oxygen during the climb. Marek had actually been reluctant to use it at first, but the expedition operator made it a requirement for everyone on the team. Their oxygen flow was set to 2 liters per minute during the ascent. It definitely helped, but it didn't cancel out the effects of the death zone. Even with supplemental oxygen, climbers at that altitude still experience slower judgment, slower reactions, and reduced physical endurance. I find that detail almost impossible to look away from. He argued against the oxygen, and the operator had to make it non-negotiable. During the afternoon before the summit push, several small issues combined to put the couple at a disadvantage. Together, they consumed far less fluid than expedition staff had recommended. Marek developed a mild headache that he dismissed as fatigue, and Agnieszka struggled to eat because of the altitude. Extremely cold conditions inside their tent also shortened the time available for proper hydration and nutrition before departure. None of these problems would have been enough to end the climb on their own, but together, they meant the couple left Camp 4 already dehydrated, underfueled, and physiologically compromised, though the extent of those deficits may not have been obvious at the time. Conditions at the South Col on the night of departure were typical for a May summit window. Temperatures were well below zero, and steady winds produced dangerously cold conditions on the South Col. Forecasters expected the weather to remain relatively stable through the morning before stronger winds and increasing cloud cover arrived later in the day, giving climbers a limited but workable window to reach the summit and descend safely. The summit push began with a loose column of climbers from 4 expedition teams following the fixed ropes up the southeast ridge. From the beginning, Marek and Agnieszka climbed at a noticeably faster pace than most of the group. Within the first stretch of the ascent, their headlamps had pulled well ahead of the other climbers below. Strong climbers often separate from the main group on summit night, so at the time, no one considered it unusual. The couple reached the balcony after making rapid progress from Camp 4. For a pair attempting their first 8,000-meter peak, their pace stood out to several members of the expedition as unusually fast. Most teams stopped there for several minutes to rest, check oxygen systems, and hydrate. Marek and Agnieszka briefly approached the resting group before continuing upward without taking a scheduled break. A Sherpa guide later recalled noticing the decision not because it violated any rules, but because it stood out from what every other climber was doing that morning. I can't stop landing on that fact. Every single other climber stopped. The decision echoed many of the ideas they had written about for years regarding self-reliance and pacing. Their earlier writings had questioned scheduled rest stops and emphasized maintaining rhythm during endurance efforts. So at the balcony, while the other climbers stopped to rest, drink water, and check their equipment, Marek and Agnieszka kept going. Later, Sherpas who were interviewed said the decision didn't seem dangerous at the time. Strong climbers would sometimes skip longer rest stops, and at that point, the couple still looked physically strong. Weirdly enough, a comment from a previous Everest video came back to me while I was writing this section. At the balcony, Marek and Agnieszka were ahead of most of the mountain and making excellent time. From the outside, there was very little to suggest anything was wrong. Above the balcony, the terrain became steeper as the couple continued toward the south summit without any documented rest or observed fluid intake. By the middle of the ascent, they had pulled completely clear of the other climbers, moving alone through increasingly severe cold at extreme altitude with intermittent gusts that made the cold feel even more severe. They had now spent several hours climbing above 26,000 feet without stopping, while witness accounts and the lack of observed drinking suggested their insulated water bottles remained largely unused. They reached the south summit after maintaining their rapid pace, with the true summit still about 90 minutes away under normal conditions. The weather remained favorable, and nothing suggested the summit window was closing. A descending climber later recalled that both appeared determined but unusually mechanical in their movements. At the time, he considered it typical summit day fatigue and continued his descent without concern. The couple continued over the Hillary Step and onto the final ridge as winds remained within the forecasted range. Although conditions appeared stable, they had now spent nearly 8 hours climbing in the death zone. Even with supplemental oxygen, prolonged exposure at that altitude steadily reduces coordination, slows decision-making, and worsens the effects of dehydration. Later reviews of witness accounts and the couple's progress on the mountain suggest that the physiological decline that had begun earlier in the climb was continuing largely unnoticed. Marek and Agnieszka reached the summit of Mount Everest shortly before 8 o'clock that morning, becoming some of the first climbers to reach the summit that day. They spent only a few minutes taking photographs and marking the achievement before beginning their descent. The sky remained clear, the weather window was still holding, and by every outward sign, the climb appeared to have gone exactly as planned. Whatever I believe about the decisions that led them there, I'm not moving past that summit moment quickly. 5 years of work, and they actually stood on top. As they descended below the Hillary Step, the first climbers heading upward from Camp 4 began passing them. Several later recalled that Agnieszka's movements appeared unusually stiff and that both climbers were descending more slowly than expected after such a strong ascent. Another climber later recalled that neither of them acknowledged passing climbers beyond a brief nod, which he initially attributed to conserving energy rather than declining cognitive function. At the time, no one considered it alarming. Fatigue on the descent is common, especially on steep, fixed-rope terrain. What did stand out to two Sherpas, however, was that neither climber appeared to be drinking. More than 8 hours into continuous exertion above 26,000 feet, most climbers were stopping regularly to hydrate, but the pattern that had begun at Camp 4 appeared to be continuing unchanged. By late that morning, as they were descending toward the balcony, Marek stopped several times along a fixed rope section. A nearby guide later said he saw Marek standing still, apparently trying to work through what looked like severe leg cramps. A short distance below him, Agnieszka had slowed enough that other climbers had to wait before they could continue down the rope. By that point, the effects of hours of climbing, dehydration, low oxygen, too few calories, and the extreme extreme cold had likely all started catching up with them. Their condition had gradually worsened to the point where short breaks were no longer enough to help them recover. Around the same time, a Sherpa descending with another client offered Agnieszka some of his own water. She accepted a few sips before continuing down. It was a generous gesture, especially at that altitude where water was limited, but it wasn't enough to make up for the dehydration that had been building since the climb began. I want to spend a second on that Sherpa. Giving away your own water at 27,000 feet is not something you do without thinking about it. Not long after that, clouds started moving in earlier than forecast, and the winds began picking up along the ridge. The temperature dropped even further, with the conditions growing noticeably colder as winds increased. Most of the climbers still on the mountain responded by picking up their pace toward Camp 4. Marek and Agnieszka, though, were still above the balcony. By then, they had slowed enough that the remaining descent would likely take longer than the weather window was expected to last. Later, 2 Sherpas descending with a client found Marek sitting on the fixed rope roughly 200 feet above the balcony. He remained upright with his oxygen mask in place, but was no longer moving. Agnieszka was a short distance above him, struggling to descend. One of the Sherpas later described her gait as lurching each step, appearing deliberate and uncertain rather than controlled, as though her legs were no longer responding reliably to her intentions. That description of her gait gets to me more than anything else in this account. She was still fighting with everything she had left. Marek appeared calm and did not behave as though he viewed the situation as immediately life-threatening. Medical consultants who later reviewed the incident believed the combined effects of hypoxia, exhaustion, dehydration, calorie depletion, and prolonged cold exposure had likely impaired his judgment enough that he no longer fully appreciated the seriousness of his condition. Before long, it had become clear to every Sherpa and guide descending past the couple that neither climber was capable of reaching Camp 4 without assistance. 2 Sherpas from separate expeditions left their own teams to assess the situation. Marek was found sitting on the slope, unable to stand, even after the Sherpas repeatedly encouraged him to try. His legs were stretched out stiffly in front of him. Later expedition debriefs described his position as consistent with severe muscle cramps, extreme fatigue, and a degree of muscular exhaustion that may have left him physically unable to continue descending. A short distance below him was Agnieszka. She was still clipped to the fixed rope and leaning against the slope. Her oxygen mask was still on, but the oxygen system appeared to be delivering less flow than intended. That regulator detail genuinely unsettled me. One small shift at the exact worst point in the entire climb. At that altitude, that lower flow offered very little benefit, leaving her exposed to the full effects of the thin air. The Sherpas quickly realized they couldn't rescue 2 climbers in that condition by themselves, especially on a steep fixed rope section. They radioed base camp and requested an emergency rescue. The expedition operator organized a team of Sherpas to climb up from Camp 4, but even in good conditions, reaching the couple meant climbing more than 1,000 vertical feet. By then, though, the weather was already starting to get worse. As the afternoon went on, conditions got worse pretty quickly. Winds picked up to around 45 miles per hour, and that pushed the wind chill down to roughly -65 to -70 degrees Fahrenheit. At that point, neither climber was really able to keep moving, and without movement, their bodies just weren't producing enough heat anymore to keep up with the cold. The same poor circulation that had already made it hard for them to move also made their hands and feet especially at risk for frostbite. The 2 Sherpas who had remained with the couple eventually concluded that continuing the rescue without additional personnel would place their own lives at unacceptable risk. They descended to the balcony and radioed their assessment. The rescue team climbing up from Camp 4 was subsequently recalled as conditions on the upper mountain continued to worsen. The last confirmed sighting of Marek and Agnieszka came from a climber at Camp 4 using a telephoto camera. The photograph showed the pair sitting close together on the fixed rope just above the balcony, both motionless. In one image, one of them appeared to have an arm slightly extended toward the other. I've come back to the photograph more than once. One arm slightly extended toward the other person. I don't know what to do with that. No later photographs showed either climber moving. By mid-afternoon, clouds had completely covered the upper mountain, and the winds had become even stronger. At that point, any further rescue attempt was no longer possible. Much of what is known about the couple's final hours comes from a reconstruction assembled from witness accounts, expedition records, photographs, weather information, and later medical review rather than from direct observation. Later reviews of the incident suggested that dehydration had gradually amplified the effects of everything else they were experiencing. Extreme altitude, prolonged exertion, dehydration, inadequate caloric intake, electrolyte imbalance, and sustained exposure in the death zone gradually reduced both climbers' physical reserves until they could no longer descend on their own. Once they became stranded, they were left exposed to the worsening weather without generating enough body heat through movement, making severe hypothermia increasingly likely. Based on witness accounts, weather conditions, and the circumstances in which they were later found, those who reviewed the incident generally believed both most likely died within the next several hours from a combination of hypothermia and progressive physiological collapse in the death zone. However, based on the available evidence, they could not determine the exact sequence of events. The bodies of Marek and Agnieszka Czerwiński were located by a Sherpa recovery team several days later during a brief break in the weather several hundred feet above the balcony on the southeast ridge. They were found seated together, still clipped to the fixed rope. Those who later documented the recovery noted that neither climber appeared to have attempted to separate or continue descending after becoming immobilized, suggesting they likely remained together until the end. That one landed on me hard. 4 together, clipped in, right where they stopped. 18 years, and neither one left the other. Marek's camera contained 34 summit photographs, 1 short summit video, and the pre-departure recording that later became an important reference for those reconstructing the couple's final climb. Because of the extreme difficulty and danger of recovering bodies from that altitude, their families agreed that they would remain on the mountain. In the weeks after the accident, expedition staff, Sherpas, climbers, and medical consultants pieced together the couple's final hours using witness accounts, summit photographs, recovered equipment, weather records, oxygen records, and timestamps from Marek's camera. Medical consultants later suggested that prolonged dehydration likely contributed to hemoconcentration and increased cardiovascular strain while compounding the effects of sustained hypoxia, calorie depletion, electrolyte imbalance, and prolonged exertion in the death zone. Those reviewing the available evidence also considered altitude illnesses such as high-altitude cerebral edema and high-altitude pulmonary edema. However, witness statements, the observed progression of symptoms, and the available evidence did not strongly support either condition as the primary cause of their incapacitation. Together, these factors most likely led to progressive physical exhaustion, impaired judgment, declining mobility, and, after both climbers became stationary, severe hypothermia. Because no autopsy was possible, no one could determine the precise physiological mechanism of death. Based on the available evidence, the most widely accepted explanation was fatal high-altitude physiological failure compounded by prolonged exposure to extreme cold. Available accounts and later reviews did not identify any clear evidence of equipment failure, guide misconduct, or a sudden unforeseen weather event as the primary factor in the tragedy. Instead, they suggest that the physiological decline had begun many hours before the extent of their physiological decline became apparent to those around them, leaving rescue impossible once they could no longer descend under their own power. Later reviews of the incident suggested that no single decision caused the outcome. Instead, a series of individually manageable choices, maintaining an unusually aggressive pace, repeatedly bypassing hydration opportunities, and relying on years of endurance experience to judge physical limits in an environment unlike any they had previously faced combined until the physiological decline became irreversible.